I've got a great story for you today, folks. This is going to be my longest pod to date, but stick through it because we've got jokes, we've got Easter eggs, and we have a cavalcade of clowns who we are going to expose. This is about the coordinated takedown of the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele. It's a story about the elitist octopus, what some would refer to as the globalists, comprised of the mainstream media, NGOs, politicians, retired bureaucrats, and academics, and how they work together in the same ecosystem to create a narrative. And as we're going to see in this segment, how they like to reverberate off of each other in order to amplify that narrative. And it's also a story about elites who fancy themselves the all knowing rulers of the universe, who claim to speak for people who are not them, people who they ultimately aim to control. And as we're going to see in our segment, these elites are completely out of touch with the people that they purport to speak for, which, as a side note, has always been one of the hallmarks of liberal progressive thinking. They always champion people who they are not, believing that they are better equipped to formulate policy for these people than those people can themselves. So let's get into it. Nayib Bukele, president of El Salvador. He's been in office since 2019. He has an approval rating of about 90%. Now, just to put that into historical context for our American viewers, FDR's highest ever approval rating was clocked in at around 83%, according to Gallup. And how did this happen? It's because when Bukele takes office in 2019, El Salvador is basically a dumpster fire. It's on the verge of becoming a failed state, not unlike Somalia. For years, it has the highest murder rate per capita of any country in the world. At one point in 2015, the murder rate was about 0.1% of the entire population. The country has a population of 6 million, approximately, with about another 2 million living abroad, mainly in the United States, having fled the violence in what many have referred to as the El Salvadorian diaspora. And so when Bukele takes office in 2019, he addresses the severe crime problem in the most obvious and direct method, given the resources he has available, by arresting criminals and targeting gangs. They deploy the military into the streets. They concentrate police power into the problem areas. They make massive arrests, which makes sense because there's a lot of criminals that need to be arrested. They disrupt gangland communications by removing cell phones and Wi-Fi from the prisons, and they build new high-tech forensics crime labs, some of the most advanced in all of Latin America. And it works. It's one of the most successful policy outcomes in Central American history. By most statistics, the crime rate plummets by about 80%. The country is transformed, brought back from the brink of total collapse and chaos. And so now you would think that the elitist octopus would have great things to say about these outcomes. The same people like Vice President Kamala Harris, or as Biden calls her, Vice Principal Pamela Hairless, who is our border czar, who waxes poetic about the need to fix the immigration crisis in the United States by addressing it at its, quote, root causes. You would think that she and the liberal octopus would have high praises for President Bukele, but you would be mistaken. In fact, what we are now seeing is a coordinated effort to try to defenestrate Bukele, to delegitimize him at every turn, and to create a narrative that he's some kind of evil authoritarian despot. We see one hit piece after another in the mainstream media trying to delegitimize him, like this one from The New Yorker by Jonathan Blitzer, who is not from El Salvador, but he is Ivy educated. And coincidentally, he would never have been able to do his piece in El Salvador before Bukele because it would have been too dangerous for him. Or this one from ABC by Connor Finnegan. Based on that name, I'm guessing he's not Latinx. Let's look at this one. This is an op-ed from the Washington Post, where the authors call for the U.S. to intervene in the internal affairs of El Salvador by, among other things, having the U.S. State Department pressure the IMF and World Bank to effectively cut El Salvador off in order to not only punish Bukele, but also apply pressure on El Salvadorian citizens by inflicting poverty on the entire country. A note about these authors: these two garbage salesmen are paragons of the octopus, both of them not from El Salvador. Juan Miguel Vivanco works for the Manhattan-based think tank called the Council on Foreign Relations. Juan Papier is a former professor and now deputy director at the NGO called Human Rights Watch, also located in Manhattan. This is their building in Midtown Manhattan, by the way. This is their office. I bring up their office buildings, which is all publicly available online, to make the point that these are metaphorical ivory towers, far removed from the reality on the ground. You got to remember, folks, when you work out of a Class A office building in Midtown Manhattan, it means you're way better suited to make decisions for El Salvadorian voters than those people can themselves because, those Cro-Magnons work on farms. Who are you going to trust? Okay, here's another NGO called Genocide Watch based out of Washington, D.C. Again, very far away from the realities on the ground in El Salvador. Just as a quick side note, their board of directors includes Samantha Powers, who you might remember from the Obama administration. Now, I bring this up because you have to remember who runs these organizations. It's basically a revolving door of assholes. Bureaucrats, politicians, mainstream media hacks, academics, and they're always giving each other these useless jobs. Now, you would think, given that 0.1% of the population of El Salvador is being murdered every year, that an organization called Genocide Watch would have some positive things to say about all these outcomes. Of course, you'd be mistaken. Here's a hit piece where they bemoan the fact that El Salvador now has a prison overcrowding problem. So what does Bukele do in response? He builds more prisons because that's what problem solvers do. They fix things. And so when Bukele addresses the prison overcrowding problem by building one of the largest prisons in Latin America, again, you'd think that the people who were just complaining about the prison overcrowding problem would have some positive things to say about the fact that he just fixed the thing they were complaining about. But Bukele cannot catch a break here. Now, I'm saving the best for last. Here's a softball radio interview a few weeks ago from the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is government funded, by the way. And who do they interview for this show? They don't interview an El Salvadorian whose life has been transformed by the dramatic decrease in crime. No, instead, they interview this lady right here. Now, look at that face, folks. Just look at that face for a minute. She looks like an angry librarian. She does not look like a very nice person. Tamara Bronner, whose organization Human Rights Watch, which is also located out of Midtown Manhattan, just recently, for the last year, they were putting out press releases condemning Bukele for the prison overcrowding problem. And in this interview, they don't even talk about the fact that he's now solved the thing they were complaining about. In fact, they condemn the fact that, of all things, he's building a really large prison. They don't like that either. He's damned if you do, damned if you don't. Now, I love this quote from the interview. They want to talk about narrative, of all things. And so this is one of the first questions in the interview where Tamara Bronner says, President Bukele continuously tries to control the narrative of what is happening in the country. Who does he think he is? The president of that country? That's not his job. That's our job. And this one right here, this is the chef's kiss. I love this. Tamara Bronner says, when asked about his popularity, she says, unfortunately, President Bukele remains extremely popular in his country. She's actually upset that he's popular because she believes that these little El Salvadorians don't really know what's good for them because they work on farms and she works in a Class A office building in Manhattan. Something that I've always noticed about these elites is that they constantly preen themselves for advancing Western ideas of democracy and rule of law. But at the same time, they believe that the will of the voters in El Salvador is somehow wrong. That when 90% of El Salvadorians can finally agree on something, which is that President Bukele pulled their country back from the brink of disaster, when that happens, they have a complete meltdown. It's though they think that they are better equipped to make decisions for El Salvadorians than those people can themselves. And the same applies to people like you and me, by the way. Just like they want to control the destiny of El Salvadorians, they want to control our destiny. And they think that they're better equipped to do it than we are. So here's my question for you folks. And please put it in the comments. Why do you think the elite octopus has such a vendetta against Bukele? Is it in spite of his success or is it because of his success? Does it have anything to do with, and we didn't touch on it in this pod, but does it have anything to do with the fact that he's a strong endorser of Bitcoin, which is a threat to central banks? I don't know. Personally, I don't have the answers. I have one theory. It's that they're upset that the policy ideas which worked were not their policy ideas. It's something that they cannot countenance because it proves that their ideas are hollow and that their jobs really are not necessary. I'm Ethan Summer. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.